poor mountain rancher found a frozen boy in his barn, then heard the child say his dead son's name. The snow fell like ash from a dying fire, covering Jacob's ranch in silence so thick it pressed against his chest. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching through ice that had formed over 3 days of bitter cold. The wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying with it the smell of winter death and the distant howl of wolves. His cattle stood huddled against the north fence, their breath rising in white clouds that disappeared into the gray morning. Too many were already gone. The weak ones had dropped first, then the old ones, then the ones who simply gave up fighting the cold. Jacob counted 11 bodies scattered across the pasture, their forms already half-buried under fresh snow. Each one meant less money, less hope, less chance of keeping the ranch through spring. Martha hadn't spoken to him in 2 days. She sat by the kitchen window, staring out at nothing, her coffee growing cold in her hands, while she watched the same spot where Samuel used to play. 3 years since the boy had fallen through the river ice. 3 years since Jacob had pulled that small, still body from the black water. 3 years since Martha had looked at him with anything but emptiness in her eyes. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, banging against the frame with each gust of wind. Jacob had meant to fix it weeks ago, but there seemed little point in mending things when everything else was falling apart. He pushed it open and stepped inside, grateful for the shelter from the wind, even if the barn offered little warmth. The horses shifted in their stalls, nickering softly at his approach. Old Belle lifted her gray head and watched him with patient eyes. She had been Samuel's horse, though the boy had been too small to ride her alone. Jacob had promised to teach him when he got bigger. When spring came, when the ice melted. But spring had come and gone 3 times without Samuel. Jacob moved toward the hay loft, thinking to throw down some feed for the horses, when he heard it. A sound so soft he might have imagined it. A whisper, a breath, something that shouldn't be there in the empty barn. He stopped, his hand reaching for the pitchfork that leaned against the wall. Rustlers had been working the valley all winter, taking cattle from desperate ranchers who couldn't afford to lose a single head. Maybe they had come for his horses. Maybe they were hiding in his barn, waiting for him to leave so they could take what little he had left. The sound came again. Not a whisper. A voice, small and weak, like a child calling from the bottom of a well. Papa. Jacob's hand froze on the pitchfork handle. The word hung in the air between the barn rafters, impossible and real. He knew that voice, had heard it every night in his dreams for 3 years, had woken up reaching for it, only to find empty darkness and Martha's back turned away from him in their cold bed. Papa, I'm cold. The voice came from the back corner of the barn, where old feed sacks were piled against the wall. Jacob's legs moved without his telling them to, carrying him forward through the dim light that filtered through gaps in the barn walls. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it might break them. Behind the feed sacks, curled in a nest of old horse blankets, lay a boy, not Samuel. Jacob's mind knew that right away, even as his heart lurched with desperate hope. This child was older, maybe 8 or 9, with dark hair where Samuel's had been light. But the boy's face was pale as snow, his lips blue with cold, and when he opened his eyes and looked up at Jacob, those eyes held the same gentle spark that had lived in Samuel's gaze. Papa, the boy whispered again, reaching up with one small hand. I found you. Jacob dropped to his knees beside the child, pulling off his own coat to wrap around the small, shivering form. The boy was half frozen, his clothes thin and torn, his feet bare and white with frostbite. How long had he been here? How had he gotten into the barn without Jacob hearing him? Easy, son, Jacob said, the word coming out before he could stop it. Easy now. You're safe. He lifted the boy in his arms, surprised by how light he felt, like a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. The child's head fell against Jacob's shoulder, and Jacob could feel the weak flutter of his breath against his neck. What's your name? Jacob asked as he carried the boy toward the barn door. The child was quiet for so long that Jacob thought he had fallen unconscious. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, the boy said, Samuel. Jacob's step faltered. He stopped in the doorway of the barn, holding the boy against his chest, staring out at the snow-covered yard where his own Samuel had built snow forts and thrown snowballs and laughed until his cheeks turned red with cold and joy. "Samuel," Jacob repeated, the name breaking something open inside his chest. The boy nodded against his shoulder. "Samuel," he said again, as if the name was the only thing he knew for certain in the whole world. Jacob carried him across the yard toward the house, his mind reeling. This wasn't his son. Couldn't be his son. Samuel was buried in the churchyard under a stone that read, "Beloved son, taken too soon." But the boy's voice, the way he had called Papa, the look in his eyes when he had reached up with that small hand, it was all so achingly familiar that Jacob felt tears freezing on his cheeks before he realized he was crying. The house was warm compared to the barn, but still cold enough that their breath showed when they stepped through the kitchen door. Martha looked up from her place by the window, and when she saw the boy in Jacob's arms, her face went white as the snow outside. "What?" she began, then stopped, staring at the child's face. "Found him in the barn," Jacob said, carrying the boy toward the sitting room where the fire still burned low in the grate. "Half frozen. Says his name is Samuel." Martha's coffee cup fell from her hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. She followed them into the sitting room, standing in the doorway like she was afraid to come closer. Jacob laid the boy on the sofa near the fire and began rubbing his hands and feet, trying to bring warmth back into the small, cold body. The child's eyes fluttered open, and he looked around the room with wonder, as if seeing it for the first time. "Mama?" he whispered, looking at Martha. Martha made a sound like something breaking. She pressed her hand to her mouth and shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said. "No, you're not. You can't be." But the boy smiled at her, the same sweet, trusting smile that Samuel had given her every morning when he climbed into their bed to wake them up. The same smile that had been buried with him 3 years ago. "I'm hungry, Mama," the boy said. "Can I have some of your biscuits?" Martha turned and ran from the room. Jacob heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard their bedroom door slam shut. He looked down at the boy, who was watching the fire with eyes that seemed older than his years. "She's scared," the boy said softly. "I make her remember sad things." Jacob pulled a quilt over the child and tucked it around his thin shoulders. "What do you remember?" he asked. "About before you came here?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Cold," he said finally. "Walking in the snow. My feet hurt. I saw the light from your barn and I knew you would take care of me. Do you remember your real name? Your family?" The boy shook his head. "Just Samuel. And that you're my papa now." Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, a door he had kept locked for 3 long years. He reached out and touched the boy's cheek, feeling the warmth returning to the pale skin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white silence. But inside, by the fire, something that had been frozen was beginning to thaw. "Rest now," Jacob whispered. "We'll figure everything out tomorrow." The boy closed his eyes and was asleep within moments, his breathing soft and steady in the quiet room. Jacob sat beside him, watching the firelight play across the child's face, wondering what kind of miracle or curse had brought this lost boy to his door on the worst night of the worst winter he could remember. Upstairs, he could hear Martha crying, soft and broken, the sound mixing with the wind outside like a song of grief that had no end. Tomorrow would bring questions he didn't know how to answer, decisions he wasn't ready to make. But tonight, there was a child by his fire, breathing and warm and calling him Papa in a voice that sounded like hope wrapped in sorrow. Tomorrow, Jacob would have to decide whether to let himself believe in second chances, or if some gifts were too painful to accept. The boy slept in Samuel's bed for 3 days, his fever coming and going like clouds across the sun. Martha would not enter the room. She cooked soup and left it outside the door, her footsteps quick and sharp on the wooden floors, as if something might chase her if she lingered too long near the place where her son once dreamed. Jacob sat beside the small bed, watching the child's face in the lamplight. When the fever broke, the boy would open his eyes and smile, calling him Papa with such certainty that Jacob's heart forgot to doubt. When the fever returned, the child would toss and mumble words in his sleep, words about cold water and falling through ice and a voice calling his name from far away. "He's not Samuel," Martha said on the third morning, standing in the kitchen doorway but looking anywhere except toward the stairs. "Samuel is buried in the churchyard, under the elm tree. You put him there yourself." Jacob poured coffee from the pot on the stove, his hands steady even though his heart was not. "I know where Samuel is buried." "Then what is that child doing in our house? In our son's bed?" The coffee was bitter and old, but Jacob drank it anyway. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained, sharp and clean and merciless. "His name is Samuel." He was half frozen. "What would you have me do? Let him die in the barn?" Martha's face went hard as winter ground. "His name is not Samuel. Samuel died 3 years ago. This boy is someone else's child, someone else's grief, and keeping him here won't bring our son back." She turned and walked away, her skirts rustling against the doorframe. Jacob heard her in the sitting room, moving furniture, folding quilts, doing the small tasks that filled her days and kept her from thinking too much about what was missing from them. He climbed the stairs to Samuel's room. The boy was awake, sitting up in bed with the quilt pulled around his shoulders. In the morning light from the window, he looked like any child might look, thin and pale but ordinary. Nothing magical about him except for the way he smiled when he saw Jacob, as if he had been waiting all his life for this moment. "Morning, Papa," the boy said, and Jacob's heart did what it always did when he heard those words. It broke a little, then put itself back together, then broke again. "Morning, son. How do you feel?" "Better. The cold is mostly gone." The boy looked around the room, taking in the wooden toys on the shelf, the picture books on the small table, the clothes hanging in the wardrobe. This was Samuel's room, wasn't it? Jacob sat on the edge of the bed. "How do you know that?" The boy shrugged, a gesture so familiar it made Jacob's throat tighten. "I just know. Like I know you used to read him stories before bed. About cowboys and horses and brave men who saved the day. Do you remember anything else? About before you came here?" The child was quiet for a moment, his fingers picking at the edge of the quilt. "Sometimes I dream about walking in the snow. My feet were so cold they felt like they were burning. I saw lights from your house, and I knew." He looked up at Jacob with eyes that seemed older than his years. "I knew I was supposed to come here, like something was calling me." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What was calling you?" "I don't know. A voice, maybe, or just a feeling." The boy tilted his head, listening to something Jacob couldn't hear. "Sometimes I think I can almost remember more, but then it slips away like water through my fingers." After breakfast, Jacob found the boy in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay with a piece of wood in his hands and Samuel's old carving knife beside him. The wood was beginning to take shape, 4 legs, a neck, the rough outline of a horse's head. "Where did you find that knife?" Jacob asked. The boy looked up, wood shavings caught in his dark hair. "In the box under the workbench, next to the other tools." He held up the half-carved horse. "Samuel liked making these, didn't he?" Jacob's breath caught. He had put that knife away 3 years ago, wrapped in cloth and buried under old horseshoes and broken harness leather. He had never told anyone where it was, not even Martha. Yet this boy had gone straight to it, as if he knew exactly where to look. "Yes," Jacob said softly. "He did." The boy went back to his carving, his small hands moving the knife with a skill that seemed impossible for a child who claimed not to remember his past. He carved the way Samuel had carved, carefully, patiently, turning the wood this way and that to find the horse hiding inside it. "Papa used to say that every piece of wood already knows what it wants to be," the boy said without looking up. "You just have to listen close enough to hear it." Jacob's legs went weak. Those were his exact words, spoken to Samuel on long winter evenings when they sat together by the fire, carving and talking and being father and son. He had never said them to anyone else, never written them down. They existed only in the space between him and his dead boy, in the memory of love that no one else had witnessed. "Who told you that?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. The boy looked up, confused. "You did. Don't you remember?" That afternoon, the boy led Jacob out into the snow-covered pasture, walking with purpose toward the line of hills that marked the edge of the ranch. His small feet moved confidently across the frozen ground, as if he knew exactly where he was going. "There's something I need to show you," the boy said when Jacob asked where they were heading. "Something important." They walked for nearly an hour, following deer trails and creek beds that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The boy never hesitated, never looked back, never seemed to doubt which direction to take. He moved through the landscape like he had walked this way 100 times before. "How do you know where you're going?" Jacob asked. "I just do. Like I know other things. Like I know you're worried about the cattle you lost, and how you're going to pay for feed, and what will happen if you lose the ranch." Jacob stopped walking. "Who told you about that?" The boy turned back, his face serious. "Nobody told me. I just know. The same way I know we're almost there." They climbed a steep slope covered in loose rock and snow, the boy scrambling ahead like a young mountain goat. At the top, he led Jacob to what looked like a crack in the rock face, a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "In here," the boy said, disappearing into the darkness. Jacob hesitated, then followed. The passage opened into a cave, larger than he would have expected, with a floor of smooth sand and walls that disappeared into shadow. And there, huddled together in the furthest corner, were cattle. More than a dozen head, bearing brands from 3 different ranches, including his own. "How did you know?" Jacob breathed, staring at the stolen animals. The boy was petting one of the cows, a gentle red heifer that Jacob recognized from his own herd. "Samuel told me," the child said simply. "Samuel told you?" The boy nodded. "In my dreams. He said the bad men brought them here after they took them from the ranches. He said you needed them back, that they would help save your home." Jacob felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The rustlers had been taking cattle all winter, and the sheriff had found no trace of them. Ranchers had lost their herds and their hope, watching their livelihoods disappear into the vast wilderness. Yet this strange boy, this child who called himself Samuel, had led Jacob straight to them. "We have to tell the sheriff," Jacob said. "Yes, but Papa." The boy looked up at him with eyes that held depths Jacob couldn't fathom. "When they ask how you found them, what will you say?" Jacob stared at the child, this impossible gift that had walked out of the snow and into his broken life. He thought of Martha, weeping upstairs and refusing to look at the boy who wore their son's name. He thought of Samuel, 3 years dead, buried under the elm tree in the churchyard. He thought of all the things that couldn't be explained, shouldn't be possible, yet were standing right in front of him in the form of a small boy who carved horses and knew secrets and led lost fathers to hidden treasures in the darkness. "I don't know," Jacob said finally. The boy smiled, the same sweet, trusting smile that had belonged to Samuel. "That's okay, Papa. Sometimes not knowing is the only honest answer." They walked back to the house as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and pink. The boy whistled as they walked, a soft melody that Jacob remembered from summer evenings when Samuel would sit on the porch steps and make music with his lips while the crickets sang their own songs in the grass. Martha was waiting for them in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. She looked at the boy, then at Jacob, then back at the boy again. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice tight with worry she didn't want to admit to feeling. "Showing Papa something important," the boy said. He walked over to Martha and took her hand in his small one. "Don't be afraid of me, Mama. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." Martha pulled her hand away as if she'd been burned, but Jacob saw the tears in her eyes before she turned away. The boy watched her go, sadness flickering across his face like shadow across sunlight. "She loved Samuel very much," the boy said quietly. "Sometimes love makes it hard to let new things in, even good things." Jacob knelt down so he was eye to eye with the child. "What are you?" he asked. "Really?" The boy considered the question seriously, as if it was something he had been wondering about himself. "I think I'm whatever you need me to be," he said finally. "And right now, you need someone to help you believe that not everything good has to die." As night settled over the ranch, Jacob sat by the fire watching the boy sleep on the sofa. One small hand dangling over the edge, the carved horse clutched in the other. Upstairs, Martha moved restlessly through their bedroom. Her footsteps a rhythm of grief and confusion that had become the soundtrack of their marriage. Tomorrow would bring the sheriff and questions about the cattle, and decisions that would change everything. Tonight, there was only the quiet breathing of a child who might be miracle or mystery, who spoke with a dead boy's voice and knew things he shouldn't know, who had walked out of the snow to save them in ways Jacob was only beginning to understand. But in the morning, Martha would have to make her own choice about what she was willing to accept, and Jacob wasn't sure either of them was ready for what that choice might cost. Sheriff Morrison arrived with the morning frost still white on the ground, his horse breathing clouds of vapor in the cold air. He was a lean man with gray whiskers and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of lawman who could track a lie through 3 counties and still have energy left to bring it to justice. "Jacob," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Martha." He nodded toward the house where Martha stood watching from the kitchen window, her face pale as the snow that still clung to the shadowed places around the barn. "Sheriff," Jacob said, walking out to meet him, "I sent word about the cattle." "That you did. Found them in Miller's Cave, you said. Funny thing about that cave. Been searched twice this winter by me and my deputies. Empty both times." Jacob felt heat rise in his neck despite the cold. "Well, they're there now. More than a dozen head from different ranches, including some of mine that went missing last month." Morrison studied Jacob's face with those sharp eyes. "How'd you come to find them, exactly? That cave's not easy to get to, and it's well hidden. Not the kind of place a man stumbles across by accident." Before Jacob could answer, the boy appeared in the doorway of the house, still wrapped in the quilt Martha had given him. He looked small and fragile in the morning light, but his eyes were bright with interest as he watched the sheriff. "Who's the child?" Morrison asked. "Found him half frozen in my barn 3 days ago," Jacob said. "Says his name is Samuel." The sheriff's eyebrows went up. "Samuel? That's a coincidence. Considering." "I know what it sounds like," Jacob said quickly, "but that's what he told me. Haven't been able to find out much else about him." Morrison walked over to the boy, crouching down so they were at the same height. "Hello there, son. What's your real name?" The boy looked up at the sheriff with serious eyes. "Samuel," he said simply. "Samuel what? What's your family name?" The child was quiet for a long moment. His brow furrowed as if he was trying to remember something that kept slipping away. "I don't know," he said finally. "I just know Samuel." Morrison stood up, brushing dust off his knees. "And you led Jacob to them cattle?" The boy nodded. "They were cold too. Like me. They needed to come home." The sheriff looked from the boy to Jacob, then back again. Something passed across his face. Doubt, maybe, or the recognition that some stories couldn't be tied up neat and clean like a Sunday package. "Well," Morrison said finally, "stolen cattle is stolen cattle, no matter how they're found. I'll need you to come with me, Jacob, help me round them up and get them back to their rightful owners. There'll be a reward, of course. Enough to see you through the rest of winter, I'd guess." As they prepared to leave for the cave, the boy began to shiver. Not the kind of shivering that comes from cold, but something deeper, as if the fever was returning. Martha watched from the window as Jacob helped the sheriff saddle fresh horses, and when the boy stumbled on the porch steps, she was outside before she realized she had moved. "You're burning up," she said, pressing her hand to his forehead. The skin was hot and dry like touching the side of a stove. "I don't feel good, Mama," the boy whispered, and the word hit Martha like a physical blow. She had been fighting against it for 3 days, but hearing it now, with the child's face flushed with fever and his eyes bright with sickness, something cracked open inside her chest. Jacob, she called, her voice carrying more urgency than she intended. The boys taken sick. Jacob was beside them in moments, lifting the child in his arms. We'll have to postpone the cattle, he told Morrison. This boy needs tending. The sheriff nodded. Cattle ain't going anywhere. I'll come back tomorrow. They carried the boy upstairs to Samuel's bed, where he had slept for 3 nights without Martha entering the room. But now she followed, bringing cool water and clean cloths, pushing aside her fear to focus on what the child needed. The fever was worse than before. It burned through him like wildfire, making him toss and mumble words they couldn't understand. Jacob sat on one side of the bed, Martha on the other, taking turns cooling his face with damp cloths and trying to get water past his cracked lips. "Mama!" the boy cried out in his delirium. But his eyes were closed, seeing something they couldn't see. "Mama, where are you? I can't find you." Martha's hand stilled on the cloth. This wasn't Samuel's voice anymore. This was something else. Something raw and desperate and heartbreaking in a different way. "The wagons are burning," the boy whispered, his head turning back and forth on the pillow. "They're shooting. Mama, run. Hide in the rocks." Jacob and Martha looked at each other across the small bed. This wasn't fever talk. This was memory, real and terrible, and finally breaking through whatever wall had kept it hidden. "Indians came at sunrise," the boy continued, his voice small and broken. "I hid under the wagon like Mama told me. But they found her. They found Papa. I heard them screaming." Martha felt tears running down her cheeks. She reached out and smoothed the boy's damp hair back from his forehead, the same gesture she had made 1,000 times with Samuel. "I waited until it was quiet," he whispered. "Then I ran. Ran and ran until my legs wouldn't work anymore. It was so cold. The snow was so deep." "What's your real name, sweetheart?" Martha asked softly. "Thomas," the boy said without opening his eyes. "Thomas William Morrison. My mama called me Tommy." Martha's breath caught. Morrison, the same name as the sheriff. She looked at Jacob, saw the same realization in his eyes. The boy, Thomas, cried out again, reaching for something they couldn't see. "Mama, don't leave me. I'll be good, I promise." Through the long night, Martha sat beside the bed, holding the child's hand while he fought through the fever and the memories that came with it. Jacob dozed in the chair by the window, but Martha couldn't sleep. She watched Thomas's face in the lamplight, seeing past the resemblance to Samuel to the individual child beneath, the different shape of his nose, the way his hair grew in a cowlick at the back, the small scar on his chin that Samuel had never had. This wasn't her son, had never been her son. But as she listened to him cry for his dead mother, felt his small hand grip hers when the nightmares came, something shifted inside her heart. Love, she realized, didn't have to make sense to be real. It didn't have to fill the exact shape of what was lost to be worth holding on to. Near dawn, the fever finally broke. Thomas opened his eyes, his own eyes, not Samuel's, and looked up at her with confusion. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm Martha," she said gently. "You've been very sick. Do you remember anything?" He was quiet for a moment, his face scrunched up in concentration. "My name is Thomas. My mama and papa are dead. Indians killed them." He looked around the room, taking in the toys and books and clothes. "This isn't my house." "No, it's not. This was our son's room, Samuel. He died 3 years ago." Thomas nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "I remember now. I was so cold and scared. I think I pretended to be him. It made me feel less alone." Martha felt her heart break and heal at the same time. "Oh, sweetheart, are you going to send me away now?" Thomas asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Now that I'm not Samuel anymore?" Martha looked at this child who had walked out of the snow and into their lives, who had saved their ranch and shown Jacob how to hope again, who had pretended to be their dead son because it made him feel less alone in a world that had taken everything from him. "No," she said quietly. "We're not going to send you away." Thomas smiled, and it was his own smile now, different from Samuel's but no less precious. Can I still call you Mama? Just until someone comes for me? Martha felt tears running down her cheeks again, but they were different tears now. Warmer. Full of possibility instead of just grief. Yes, she whispered. You can call me Mama. Jacob stirred in his chair, waking to find Martha holding Thomas's hand while the boy slept peacefully for the first time since he had arrived. She looked up at her husband, and he saw something in her face that had been missing for 3 long years. Not the old happiness that was buried with Samuel and always would be, but something new, a different kind of hope. We'll have to tell Morrison, Jacob said softly. Martha nodded. Thomas Morrison. The sheriff might have family back east. Relatives who could take him. They sat in the quiet morning light, watching the boy sleep, both of them thinking the same thought they couldn't yet say out loud. What if there was no family? What if no one came for him? What if this child who had pretended to be their son could become something just as precious? Not a replacement for what they had lost, but a new beginning built on the foundation of what they had learned about love and loss and the courage it took to open your heart again. Outside, spring was still months away, but something was stirring beneath the frozen ground, patient and persistent and full of promise. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, when the first patches of brown earth were beginning to show through the snow like promises of spring. Sheriff Morrison rode up to the house with it in his coat pocket, his face grave with the weight of news that would change everything. Thomas was in the kitchen with Martha, learning to crack eggs for breakfast. His small hands were careful and deliberate, the same way Samuel's had been when Martha first taught him. But Thomas was not Samuel, and Martha no longer needed him to be. Over the past month, she had fallen in love with this boy for who he was: quiet and thoughtful, quick to laugh, slow to complain, with a way of listening that made grown-ups feel heard and understood. "Morning, Martha." "Thomas," Morrison said, removing his hat as he stepped through the kitchen door. "Jacob around?" "In the barn," Martha said, wiping flour from her hands. Something in the sheriff's voice made her stomach tighten. "Is everything all right?" Morrison looked at Thomas, who was watching him with curious eyes. "Might be we could talk when Jacob gets here. All of us together." Jacob came in from the cold, his cheeks red with wind and work. He had been mending fence posts, getting ready for the cattle they would buy with the reward money from the rustlers. The ranch was saved now, secure for another year, maybe more if they were careful and lucky. "Sheriff," Jacob said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Morrison pulled the letter from his pocket. The envelope was worn soft from traveling, addressed in careful handwriting to Sheriff Morrison, Canyon Creek, Montana Territory. "Got word from back east," Morrison said. "About Thomas here." The boy looked up from the eggs, his face suddenly serious. "About me. About your family, son. Seems you got an aunt in Kansas. Your mother's sister. She's been looking for you since she heard about what happened to your folks' wagon train." Martha felt something cold settle in her chest. She looked at Thomas, who had gone very still, his small hands resting on the edge of the table. "My Aunt Sarah?" Thomas said quietly. "Mama told me stories about her. She has a farm with chickens and a big garden." Morrison nodded. "That's the one. Sarah McKinnon. She's been writing letters to every sheriff and marshal from here to California, hoping to find you. When I sent word about a boy named Thomas Morrison, she wrote back right away. Sent a description that matches you perfect, and some family details that prove you're her kin." Jacob sat down heavily in his chair. "When is she coming for him?" "She's not. Too far to travel, and her husband's been poorly. But she sent money for passage on the stage, and arranged for a family friend to escort Thomas back to Kansas. They'll be here next week." The kitchen fell quiet except for the sound of snow melting off the roof, dripping into puddles outside the window. Thomas stared at the broken eggshells in his hands, his face a mixture of hope and sorrow that was too old for his years. "Next week," Martha said softly. Morrison folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. "I know this is hard. Boy's been like family to you folks. But blood is blood, and this aunt of his has a legal claim. She can give him a proper home, education, a future. He has that here, Jacob said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. They were childless ranchers who had barely survived the winter. Sarah McKinnon was family, with a farm and stability and the right to claim her sister's boy. That afternoon, while Thomas was outside building snow horses with sticks for legs, Jacob and Martha sat by the fire and talked about letting go. "He belongs with his blood family," Martha said, her fingers busy with mending that didn't really need doing. "It's the right thing." "I know," Jacob said. "Doesn't make it easier."
"No."
"It doesn't." They watched through the window as Thomas worked in the yard, his breath making clouds in the cold air. He was humming to himself, the same tuneless song Samuel used to hum when he was concentrating on something important. "We'll make sure he's ready," Martha said. "Teach him what we can in the time we have left." Over the next week, the house filled with quiet preparations. Jacob taught Thomas to read better, sitting with him in the evenings by the fire, working through the alphabet and simple words with the patience of a man who understood that some gifts could only be given once. "Cat," Thomas would say, pointing to the letters on the page. "Dog." "Horse." "Good," Jacob would say. "Now try this one." "Love," Thomas read carefully. "What does that mean exactly, Papa?" Jacob looked at the boy, this child who would leave them soon, who had taught them both how to hope again. "It means caring about someone so much that you want what's best for them, even when it hurts you to give it." Martha spent her days sewing. She had found Samuel's winter coat in the bottom of the trunk, never worn because he had died before the weather turned cold enough for it. She took it apart carefully, saving every piece of good cloth, and began making a new coat sized for Thomas. Her fingers worked steadily, stitching love into every seam, making sure it would be warm enough for the long journey ahead. "Why are you making me a new coat?" Thomas asked, watching her work by lamplight after supper. "Because Kansas gets cold in winter," Martha said. "And because every boy needs a coat made by someone who loves him." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Will you still love me after I go away?" Martha's needle stopped moving. "Oh, sweetheart, love doesn't stop just because people go away. It stays right here." She pressed her hand to her chest. "And here," she touched his chest, "forever." The night before Thomas was to leave, Jacob took him out to the barn to say goodbye to the horses. They stood beside Belle's stall, the old mare nuzzling Thomas's hair with her soft nose. "I wish I could take her with me," Thomas said. "She's too old for traveling," Jacob said. "But she'll remember you." Horses have good memories for people who are kind to them. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, their footsteps crunching on the snow that was growing softer each day as spring crept closer. The air smelled different now, less sharp, full of promises that winter couldn't keep forever. "Papa," Thomas said as they reached the porch, "thank you for letting me pretend to be Samuel. It helped me feel less scared." Jacob knelt down so they were eye to eye. "You don't ever have to pretend to be anyone but yourself, Thomas. You're a fine boy just as you are." The stage came on a bright morning when the snow was melting fast, creating streams and puddles that reflected the blue sky. Mrs. Patterson, the family friend Sarah McKinnon had sent, was a kind woman with gray hair and gentle eyes who spoke to Thomas like he was precious cargo she was honored to protect. "Your Aunt Sarah is so excited to see you," she told him as Jacob loaded his small bundle of belongings into the stage. "She's been cooking for days, making all your mother's favorite foods." Thomas nodded, but his eyes kept drifting back to Jacob and Martha, standing together on the porch like they were memorizing the moment. Martha gave him the coat, and he put it on immediately even though the morning was warming. It fit perfectly, the wool dark blue like winter sky, with bone buttons that caught the light. "It's beautiful," he said, stroking the soft fabric. "It feels like a hug." "That's because there's a lot of hugs sewn into it," Martha said, kneeling to button it properly. "One for every day until we see you again." "Will I see you again?" "If you want to," Jacob said. "You know where we are. And we'll write letters, if your aunt says it's all right." Thomas threw his arms around Martha first, Then Jacob, holding tight like he could take their love with him if he squeezed hard enough. "I'll write every week," he promised. "And I'll tell Aunt Sarah all about you, and how you saved me from the snow, and how you taught me to read and carve horses and be brave." The stage driver cleared his throat. "Time to go, folks. Got a schedule to keep." Thomas climbed into the stage, his face pressed to the window as it pulled away. Jacob and Martha stood in the yard, waving until the dust cloud disappeared around the bend in the road, and they could no longer hear the sound of wheels and hooves. The house felt different after he left. Not empty the way it had been after Samuel died. That had been a hollow, aching emptiness that threatened to swallow everything. This was more like the quiet after a good song ends. Sad but somehow complete. They found ways to fill the silence. Jacob bought new cattle with the reward money, young stock that would grow strong and healthy. Martha planted a garden, working the earth with her hands until it was ready for seeds. They talked about Thomas in his letters, which came faithfully every week, full of news about Kansas and Aunt Sarah and the chickens he was learning to tend. One morning in late April, as Jacob was walking out to check on the new calves, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Laughter, light and joyful, carried on the spring wind. For a moment his heart jumped, thinking Thomas had come back. But when he turned toward the sound, there was only empty pasture and blue sky and the whisper of wind through new grass. Samuel, he thought. Or maybe it was Thomas. Or maybe it was just the sound of love continuing, finding new ways to exist in the world even after goodbyes had been said. Martha came out to find him standing in the middle of the yard, his face turned up to the sky like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. "What is it?" she asked. Jacob smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him since the stage had carried Thomas away. "Spring," he said simply. "Just spring." But as they walked back to the house together, Martha could have sworn she heard it too. The sound of children laughing somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, as if love had its own voice and its own way of promising that nothing truly precious ever really ends. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.